to current day issues. I guess someone had a very technical question. Um, oh, actually, let's start with this one. Please talk about the parallels between what happened then and what is happening now. Do we have a chance now to begin making significant progress again?
So, thank you all for your questions. I wanted to say that. Thank you, Halima and Edith, for facilitating this part of the program. Um, I think the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen in the last years, and especially since the murder of George Floyd, has been astonishing. And it has reminded me very much of the momentum and breadth and hugeness of the movement that we had around Angela's defense. It's also, I want to point out, the Black Lives Matter is also global in its impact. It's all over the world in different forms in different places depending upon what's going on. Um, I also want to point out that in this recent election, after the really proto-fascist white supremacist invasion of the Capitol, the election was carried by the organizing of the black community, in particular black women. It's astonishing what happened in this last election, and I think we should all recognize that it's not only electoral politics, people in the streets, it's everything coming together, making a huge impact. I think we have a long road ahead. I think it's very difficult. I think the country is very badly divided in a way that was a little different than it was when Angela was on trial. But I'm also quite optimistic about what's possible and the kind of unity that we're witnessing, that we're all witnessing. And I remind people that this crazy electoral college that we have, despite that, please remember that Biden and Kamala Harris won the popular vote by 7 million. By 7 million. So that's all speaks to me to a certain kind of momentum. And I just want to say, every era is different. Every generation is different. Everybody finds their own way. But I know that many people, when we saw the protests that were taking place for Black Lives Matter, we felt like we were back. I remember my wife said to me, "It feels like we were in the '60s and '70s again." It did. It had that feeling, and it was tremendously moving.
There's one question that's a little bit related here, and it says, it seems from the experience at the Black Panther headquarters, violence would be inevitable in revolution. Does revolution require violence?
This is I'm laughing because this is the age-old debate that always happens in in movements, and and we're in different. Remember that you're in different historical times and different historical periods, so you can't just assume various things. But what I'd say about that is that the government has enormous weaponry at its command. And if it seeks to maintain itself in power, and it's not inevitable, but it may resort to the use of police and military force to sustain itself in power. And that becomes this age-old debate about when and how and should there be armed resistance. And and it was the debate also that went on in this time period with the Black Panther Party. I mean, the police had made the decision. Hoover had declared the Panther Party basically this organization that had to be exterminated. And we know now, through congressional investigation and so forth, that there was this organization called COINTELPRO. That's counterintelligence program. That was totally illegal. but that went and was very responsible for the murder of many people in the revolutionary movement at the time, and also just creating terrible divisions and splits and generally wreaking havoc. I mean, even I was subject to COINTELPRO. My goodness. So I'm just trying to say, I think that people who are involved in revolutionary movements seeking to change the system, the main thing about it is to have the largest number of people possible and the largest and most diverse coalition that you can put together. The more people you have, the more united you are, the less violence is likely. That's all I could say. I don't know in our examples, if we look at things, if we look at countries and so forth, most of the revolutionary movements have involved violence. It's just historical. You can just look at it and you can see that that's true. One last comment on this, because there's been a lot of discussion about it. If you look at the period following the United States Civil War, from 1865 on, and you see the way in which the former slaveholders organized themselves to destroy Reconstruction, and Black Reconstruction in particular. And this is all documented. It's in the work of Dr. Du Bois, in the work of Eric Foner, many, many, many scholars. And it's shown how terrible terror, terrible violence, lynchings, and so forth were used to suppress the Black, formerly enslaved Black people who resisted fiercely and with tremendous courage. So there's, you see, a backlash where the violence was directed to stop them from voting, from building schools, from all kinds of civil rights.
Thank you for that. Before we move on, do you mind speaking up a little bit or being closer to your microphone? I think some people are having
Sure.
a hard time hearing
Right.
you. And
I will turn the sound up on my computer
Edie will
too.
jump
I
in with
had
the
turned the
next
sound down.
question.
Is this better? Can you hear me now better?
Yeah, it's a little better. Thank you. So a lot of kind of some of the questions are kind of focused around this idea of how radical movements for liberation can be co-opted by people in power, and I think we can see some of the response this past summer to the uprisings, how the power of people in movement and in solidarity together can be kind of undermined by the strategies that, like, I guess this gets at the should violence be used or not, but how do you see the strategies changing a bit today because of the kind of quicker access to media attention? And I guess that links to another question before is, well, how did this build to be a global movement without the internet, without cell phones, without organizing, right? So I think people are kind of thinking about these things, looking at some of the challenges of organizing today beyond the slacktivism or just putting a like and making that a kind of commentary. And then as a related note, how do you speak with people about this legacy when we're hearing again the fears of socialism, fears of communism in our media? We're kind of how do we navigate this political and media landscape today?
So thank you, Edie. That's a multifaceted question with a lot of different aspects of it, but it's good to put it all together. And so one of the things I'd say about this, first of all, I was struck by, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have computers, we did not have the internet. We had the United States mail. And we had telephones, and we had telegraphs, telegrams, we could say telegrams. But it meant that our organizing, this is interesting though, you see, because it meant that the organizing was door to door. It meant that the organizing was in the street. It meant that the organizing was going to meetings, like trade union meetings, for example, school board meetings, for example, parent-teacher associations, the teachers' union, unions and so forth, civil liberties groups, civil rights groups. We physically went and talked to people, one-on-one, just like talking to people and saying, and answering questions. And so it had a very different human element to it than just being online. I mean, it really changes things when you're, talking to people one-on-one, whether it's door to door, or like I said, like in campaigns, in political campaigns, or that you're in meetings with people. And you can answer questions and you can respond and you can have a dialogue in a certain kind of way. So there's advantages to that. On the other hand, you know, I mentioned in the introduction that Angela and I co-edited this book together. If they come in the morning, we got the title from an open letter that James Baldwin had written in defense of Angela. So, so that was very awkward, And then we had to go through the mail, and we had to write to people, and we had to get their writings back in various ways, and some people were in jail, and so we had to go through the lawyers, and it was a very cumbersome process. But of course, we did it, and it worked. People probably don't even remember we had something called mimeograph machines. If we wanted to get out leaflets, we couldn't print. You had mimeograph machines. It was literally running it off. I'm going like this because you're running it off on a drum that you typed up a paper, and then you ran it on a drum. So these are all the technological changes that have happened. On the other hand, the internet gives us a global, instantaneous global connection that's just extraordinary now. And I've been so impressed with it, and being able to talk with people like this, like on Zoom like this, where you can connect with people in various places. I want to say that the beginning of that question was about co-optation. The co-optation, the capitalist system, boy, it is really good at co-optation. I mean, it can take slogans and co-opt them into products. It's just like sort of endless. So you have to be on your toes about it. You have to be aware of it. You have to think about, okay, what do we really mean? What is the point about all this? And the other thing is, it was the question about the question about socialism. Oh my gosh, it's such a buzzword, and that the Republicans used it a lot. In fact, Kamala Harris is not a communist, and she's not a socialist. I mean, it's amazing how they use these terms to try to make people afraid. And so part of what we need to do is try to. Bernie Sanders is a democratic socialist. So part of what you're trying to do is teach people, educate people, make people less afraid to understand what it is, and the emphasis on democratic and what you're talking about in terms of making, for example, healthcare should be universal. Now that exists in non-socialist countries also, but it existed in socialist countries as well. So education should be free. Education should be available. It has to do with how you distribute your resources. Do you distribute your resources in order to build a military-industrial complex and to maintain prisons and have this mass incarceration and police fortifications? Or do you use your resources in order to benefit the vast majority of people in the country? I think those are the kinds of questions that socialism raises in a very productive way. And then try to get people not to be so frightened, not to be so afraid.
So one of the questions is interesting. It's what happened to the movement that organized around freeing Angela? Can you trace where that mobilization went for us within the landscape of social movements? Good question.
That's a great question. So the first thing that happened, I think the film ended with that rally in Madison Square Garden, if I remember correctly, right? And that was the last scene. And there were 20,000 people there. So within a year of the end of the trial, I believe it was 1973, the trial ended in 72, we organized something called it was again Committee Against Political Repression, racist and political repression. And that was a sort of reincarnation of the various defense committees that had existed all over the country, trying to organize a mass movement that would be in defense of political prisoners in their various locations, and would organize around that. So that's just in the United States. And we did that. We organized that committee. It was the National Committee Against Political and Racist and Political Repression, I think was the exact name of it. And we had an opening convention, which I believe was in Chicago, and we organized and we tried to convert the chapters that had been in the different cities and so forth to free Angela to be working on cases of other political prisoners. But the truth is that it didn't have the same momentum. It didn't have the same momentum because Angela's case had a particular, it was a particular historical moment, a particular joining of things, and her charisma and her feeling that people had for her galvanized a huge amount of support. But we did continue organizing, and I think perhaps another thing to say about that is, and we did successfully free, for example, there was a case involving a case in North Carolina that the committee did successfully free some political prisoners in the country whose trials were going on. I might also point out that in 1998, Angela, in addition to many other people, organized a conference to found an organization called Critical Resistance. And the founding conference was held at UC Berkeley on the campus. But, and there were, I think we expected maybe 1,000 people or something. My memory is that something like 3,000 people showed up, which was way more than anybody had anticipated. And we had panels on different aspects. And one of the features of these panels, the way sisters and brothers envisioned it, was that there was a scholar, there was a community activist, and there was someone who had been incarcerated. So you had this dialogue taking place, and that was really the beginning of a mass movement in this country against mass incarceration. That's what that was about. And so again, that was a transfiguration from those different times as the movement continued. And I see the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a new generation. But there's a line. You can follow a historical line in terms of these movements and how they continue, and they continue because the oppression continues, and because the racism continues, and because people are being persecuted and prosecuted and killed in the street by police. And I'm just continually appalled at yet another case, and another case, and another case of police killings of unarmed, mostly Black people, mostly men, but also women. And it's just, it really, I think part of it, and then I'll just come back to say one other thing about this that's so striking about it, is that because of the internet, you actually see it. I mean, people record it on their phones, and you are watching the murders take place. And the frame-ups take place. There was a case in South Carolina, I believe, where the officer killed the guy, shot him in the back, and then placed a gun underneath his body. And there was a guy standing there in the shadows. He was behind wherever he was behind. He recorded the whole thing. And you're just left, well, it's just appalling. But of course, somebody in the film said, one of the brothers in the film said, this has been going on forever in the Black community, this kind of repression. So it's not new. What's new is an awareness. There's an awareness because of visibility. And the last thing I'd say, just to point out, in these last protests of Black Lives Matter, spontaneously, many white people participated. And I think that was, as allies, I think that was very important.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things I've been kind of debating in terms of how to both teach this kind of historical context for current events, but also to be sensitive to the harms that can come from addressing police violence and addressing, mass incarceration and solitary confinement and so many of the human rights abuses that we have here in California. Because of the hyper exposure and like you were just mentioning, the almost kind of pornographication of these sorts of encounters, how do you think folks urging prison abolition, urging kind of decarceration or other strategies should try to move forward attentive to this tension, right? The kind of increased visibility, but also the harms that can come from the very making images of Black death and harm go viral?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I'll respond to it by saying we have to also have images of beauty, of peace, of healing, of culture, of cultural expression. And I was thinking about this as you were talking, because I had this wonderful graduate student who's now a professor. Her name is Erin Gray, and she's a marvelous scholar. And her field was on lynching. She did a study of lynching. And I remember she gave some guest lectures in my class. And she debated about what kinds of images to show the students, because they are so disturbing. They're just appalling. And then at the same time, she often would show art made by Black artists to show cultural expression of humanity. And I think that's the kind of balance that we have to try to strike. And when we look at the protests, for example, of Black Lives Matter, I remember one scene I saw that was so incredibly moving to me. Here are these young people, and they had their arms linked in various ways, and there was a young man, and a young Black man, and he was crying as this protest was taking place, and I think with emotion, of what was happening. And a young Black woman next to him had a handkerchief, and she took the handkerchief and wiped his tears. And so the photograph was just that moment of wiping his tears. And that is such a moment of humanity, such a beautiful moment of two human beings in this throng of tens of thousands of people. So I think when we're teaching, when we're using this material, we have to tell the truth about it, but we also have to be mindful of showing images that show the violence, and then at the same time showing people, look, there is a community that produces art, that produces music, that produces theater, that produces dance. And there's so many images of that can also be shown at the same time, so that you get more of the fullness of the humanity of people.
The vulnerability. Yeah. Couple questions that go directly to Dr. Davis's experience, and if you have insight. One is, did Dr. Davis feel any pressure to turn herself in when Black women with afros and gaps were being racially profiled? Did she ever speak to you about those times, and what did she say?
Well, she didn't. I don't have any direct memory of a conversation, particularly about turning herself in. I think she was. I wanted to just let me say, her sister Fania Davis was brought in for questioning, and Fania describes the kind of third degree, that they did with her, in taking her into a room and sitting her in a chair and having a bright light on top of her and demanding to know where Angela was. And they did. They racially profiled. They had this general description, like he said, of an afro and a space between the teeth, but it was also just an occasion to harass, just to be harassing, just to be police harassing of people in the Black community. I don't think that ever caused her to think about turning herself in particularly, so much as just a demonstration of, once again, the police tactics and attempt at intimidation of people. It was a sort of a continuation of that. There was a question earlier that I saw in chat that you sent to me, and I just wanted to say that one of the reasons, I think the main reason Angela said that she didn't want to try to leave the country was she didn't want to leave her family. She didn't want to leave her mother. Mrs. Davis was an extraordinary human being, just extraordinary human being, who did marvelous work, and we all loved her, just loved her. And she was bedrock for us. And but anyway, during that period, I think she was undecided about what to do, and was trying to think about a way that would protect her. And so part of what was going on to think about in this time was we were organizing movements for her defense already before she had been arrested, but after she had been indicted. We had mass demonstrations, mass protests, and I think that was part of trying to ensure that they would not kill her when she was arrested. I don't think there was a question about whether she would be arrested, but that we wanted to try to create enough of a mass movement that it would be quite untenable to kill her. And of course they didn't. But when she described that scene, you remember when she's on the tarmac after she's taken from the Women's House of Detention, and she's on the tarmac, and they surrounded it with National Guard troops, and there's that plane, and she said she didn't even think she should sneeze because they would shoot her. So there was always this continual danger. But that's sort of a general response, I think, to your question.
It seems to me here that we have a few questions kind of about some of the legal technicalities of the case, which I think are interesting because they set up, for me, at least as a critical legal studies person, questions about how you see the role of the law, right? It was both the kind of the threat of punishment and a persecutor, but also set her free, ultimately, with the power of the jury's verdict. So we had some questions kind of about how did she get, how long did it take to get out on bail? How did that bail? And then a question that I was really moved by and actually had forgotten until I watched this again this time was the farmer, the Fresno person. And so some of the kinds of questions that I think you can incorporate here, what was the role of the law and how, how did y'all navigate that being both a punitive force, but also a force for liberty?
Well, it's a great question.
Just giving you all the easy ones.
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you look at the law, just the constitutional guarantees of the law, like the right to bail or due process, equal protection, that's the 14th Amendment. If you look at those aspects of the law, they're very powerful. That you can't be forced to testify against yourself. That's the Fifth Amendment. Those things are very, very powerful. You can't be prosecuted for speech. These are very, very powerful things that are embedded in the law. The question is, to what extent can you access them? To what extent can you make them viable? So let's take the question of bail, for example. In the case of Angela. So in the state of California, this might have been a little confusing to people in the film, so I'll just explain it just a little bit. In the state of California, we had a death penalty. Everybody knows that now because she was faced with the death penalty. But there was a statute, I think it was 1270 in the penal code, that said that if a person was arrested in a capital offense for whom guilt was likely, that's something like the wording, bail could be denied. So you can see that statute in the law violated the presumption of innocence, right? Because you can't have it both ways. Either you're presumed innocent or you're presumed guilty. But if you're going to, cornerstone of American law is that you're presumed innocent. So we were fighting for bail because it asserted that presumption of innocence. It was an assertion of that constitutional right. In a completely separate case involving a totally different case, had nothing to do with us, and we didn't even know, I didn't even know, maybe other people knew, I didn't even know it was pending before the Supreme Court. It was a death penalty case. The guy had been convicted, and they were seeking to overturn the death penalty, the constitutionality of the death penalty. And so in that Supreme Court decision in California Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional because it constituted cruel and unusual punishment. And so that happened, and as soon as that happened, it invalidated that section of the law that said that she wasn't entitled to bail, right? Because it was a capital case. Well, we no longer had a capital case. So that's why Howard Moore, you saw that in the film, rushes into Leo into the chambers with the judge and demands that she be released on bail. And he does. And he releases her on, he says, yes, if you can put the money together, the bail is set at $102,500. Right? So we knew that this was going to happen. I was actually in New York at the time that this unfolded before the bail hearing, and got a phone call, and Howard said, get the bail, because that was my job. I was supposed to get the bail. So what I did was I said already that I called Aretha Franklin, but anyway, I called Roger McAfee, and he was this farmer, like we said, in Fresno, and you heard him. I mean, he's a very beautiful guy, and he put up his farm. So his farm was worth $300,000. And what he did was he had to prove that. So he worked 24/7 with his wife, Dolores. They worked 24/7 with their tax people to put together the documentation as to the value of the farm. And when we went to that bail bondsman, Roger was there. He and I were outside the courtroom together all the time, talking to each other and so forth. And we were both nervous wrecks, But when Howard came out and said we got what we came for, we went to Sparacino, who was then the bail bondsman, and we said to him, "Will you take Roger McAfee's farm as collateral?" And he had all the paperwork. He was pulling out all the paperwork and everything to show him that the farm was worth $300,000. And that's what the Sparacino did. Then we had to put up the 10,000. You have to put up 10%. But that wasn't a big problem because we had a defense fund. And we had already put together, I think Franklin Alexander put the money together. We already had the $10,200 and whatever dollars, or whatever it was that we had to have. So we had that in cash, which you lose. You give that to the bail bondsman, you lose that no matter what happens with the case. And then he had to accept the farm as collateral. So that was a little bit about how. So there again, you can see that we were using every aspect of the law that we possibly could. I'll mention one other thing in the law, just as an example. Angela decided, the lawyers decided it would be great if she would be co-counsel. If she could be co-counsel. Now that's a constitutional right. You can be your own counsel, or you can be co-counsel. And the prosecutor really resisted that. But it was a very important strategy, you see, because Angela is very eloquent and very, very articulate, and also very brilliant, and was studying the law herself. So I remember she wrote me a letter. I was in Germany at the time for the defense, and she wrote me this letter about appearing in court with her statement, the statement that she's going to make to the judge about why she could be co-counsel. She had studied all the different precedents for it. She presented it to the judge and so forth. It was opposed by the prosecution, but she was successful. And so she was made co-counsel. Now that was very important because what happened was in the trial, she presented her own opening statement. So she could talk to the jury directly without testifying. And so there again, you see, there's a strategy of using legal, what's legal, what you can do. So having said all of that, let me point out, we had 5 lawyers. We had a huge defense team. We had many, many lawyers who volunteered their time, worked pro bono to do research for us on this case. the average person who gets arrested doesn't have any of these resources. Doesn't have a battery of lawyers, especially if they're black or brown or Native American or whatever. So, or Chicano. Or like I think about the immigrants now at the border, they don't have these resources. So you have the law, but unless you can implement the law, unless you can force the courts to honor the law, so what? So it exists, So that was part of it's a very, very big lesson. The law can be very powerful, can be a very powerful weapon, a very powerful force for good, for decency, for to force a fair trial. But on the other hand, you have to be able to have the knowledge of the law to be able to implement it.
Very important for our justice studies students and future lawyers to think about. There's another question from the audience, and it was it ever uncovered who set Angela Davis up as playing a role in the crime? Did anything happen with the person who started this?
So the basic answer is no, because it wasn't quite set up like that. I don't think it really happened like that. I think in this particular case, the guns were registered in her name, and it was only a matter of time before they would find that out. They were all legally purchased. Most of them had been purchased years before, and as she said in the film and explained in the film, they were for her. They had been bought initially for her own self-defense because of the number of death threats she was receiving when she was teaching at UCLA and that whole controversy that developed. And that was a period also, remember, that the Panthers are being attacked by the police. I mean, unless you can go back and try to imagine what that time period was like, it was very frightening. I myself, as an activist on the Berkeley campus, had multiple death threats. And if you went to the police, which I did, after all, I'm white, I was a student and so forth, so I went to the police and they said, well, we can't do anything until somebody does something. Well, thank you. The whole point is to prevent them from doing something, like that would be really nice. So even then people said I should be armed, and I was given some weapons, and well, that's a whole other story. And they actually taught me how to shoot and things like that. But it wasn't something I could figure out what to do with. And I'm just saying that it wasn't so unusual to have weapons for your own self-defense in that time period. And she did. So I'm saying I don't think anybody set her up. I think that certain events unfolded. And one of the things a lot of times people ask, well, how did Jonathan Jackson get the guns? So obviously she knew Jonathan. And if you see in the footage of some of the films, he's standing right next to her in the young, very young fellow who's standing right next to her when she's giving some of her speeches for the Soledad brothers. That's Jonathan. And so they put the weapons into the Soledad house in Los Angeles as a safety for them, but it was in a cabinet that wasn't locked. And we can say all kinds of things about what should have been, what should have happened, so forth. But he took them, and he had this idea about what he wanted to do, and we don't really know what the whole plan was. Nobody knows. We have no idea. I think it was clear that the hostages were taken just to ensure a safe escape. But it was naivete in terms of how especially the San Quentin guards, were going to respond to that. Of course, they were going to shoot to kill. By the way, that gunfire lasted 9 seconds. There's a recording of it. 9 seconds, and all those people were killed and wounded. And all the shooting was from outside. The prisoners never fired a shot. They didn't shoot. It was all from outside. So we got that in the forensics during the trial. So again, I don't think anybody set her up. I think that there were a set of circumstances that happened. And without maybe people thinking through what the implications were of what they were doing. I hope that's helpful.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Edie?
I guess, I mean, I think we have about 15 minutes left. So if folks have any other questions, they should put them in the Q&A, please. Selfishly, I will ask what you think we should do. There's some questions here I'm incorporating from the Q&A. But what kind of lessons would you give to folks that are organizing today? What do you think we need to do next as we move forward to champion Angela's legacy? But I especially am kind of curious how you think we can move forward with this international solidarity, and how we can kind of strengthen those ties once again.
So I sort of threw my head up like that because, I don't know, but I can tell you what I think. First of all, we should recognize that all human beings on this planet, all beings on this planet are interconnected. We're all intertwined with each other. All forms of life are intertwined with each other. And I start this way because one of the things that's confronting us right now that we didn't have at least awareness of in the 70s is climate change. All of these questions are going to be moot if we don't tackle the question of the changing climate. And it's all tied in together. Everything intersects with everything else. So, I mean, the poverty, the racism, the white supremacy, the fear of immigrants, the number of immigrants, the migrations that are taking place, I'm thinking also of Europe and so forth, is all about people having to move because of war, because of famine, because of conditions in their home countries, which are intertwined with imperial intrigue that has been going on, and colonialism that's been going on for generations, and the racism that's been going on. But it's also intertwined with climate change that's happening, which is a consequence of fossil fuels. And we know this. We have the science. We understand what needs to happen. So I'm putting all of this together because I'm thinking, for example, of the tremendous struggle at Standing Rock a couple of years ago to stop the Keystone Pipeline. And one of the slogans was, water is sacred, women are sacred. That's an extraordinary slogan. And how many thousands of people came to support the folks at Standing Rock? And, Native Americans from all over the country and many, many allies that supported that movement. So the first thing to recognize is how we're all intertwined and how we're all interconnected. And then if we get that, then the next logical thing is we have to listen to each other. We have to listen to each other. We have to respect. We have to figure out how to make the largest possible coalition of folks. Even if we don't agree on everything else, can we agree on this point, on that point? And for example, like we said in Angela's case, when we approached people on the right to bail, they might have believed that she was guilty, but they did believe in her right to a fair trial. So if you can find common denominator like that, it's very important, I think, to build that kind of a movement, that kind of solidarity. Angela's a tremendous force for solidarity now. If you think about all the places that she's been in the world, her support for indigenous people, her support for the Palestinian people, and her support for various African nations and solidarity struggles, she's a wonderful, example of that kind of solidarity and and respect for people and so forth. So that's the kind of thing I think we have to do. And I see it. I see us doing it. I see people doing it. But I also see how divided this country is. And I also see how white supremacy has such a grip in this country, and how it can be used. So we have a lot of work to do to try to break down that white supremacy and that fear. It's embedded in fear. And we just have a lot of work to do because that has to change. We have to find a way to talk to people and to so one. I'll just end with this. I saw a beautiful op-ed piece in the New York Times. Today's Monday. Yesterday's New York Times op-ed piece. I'm sorry I don't remember the name of the woman who wrote it, but she said she was a hillbilly, and what she meant was that she was from Appalachia, and came from a coal mining family, and got out and became educated and is a journalist now. She wrote this beautiful piece because she said people don't know the history of the militancy of coal miners who fought troops and and to form a union and for better working conditions and for safety and health conditions and so forth. And she talked about the strikes in the movement is the early part of the 20th century. And she's right. And what happens, so then this becomes really important. What happens is the coal companies are on the boards of trustees of the schools and make sure that that stuff isn't taught. And she's saying, people have to know their history. We have to teach people what their history is and have pride in white working class people, and what they've done in this country has been very, very powerful. Think about the Mesabi Iron Range in Minnesota, you know. There's a huge history here of working class, white working class, black working class people that have worked together. And I'll add also, you know, Latinx people in the Southwest and so forth. There's a huge history of struggle in this country, and understanding that becomes just very important, I think, to helping people to be able then to listen, to say, oh, this is part of my heritage. These are my people. Now let me listen to that. And then we have a bridge on which we can talk to each other.
Bettina, this story about the trial and your work in the trial is about friendship. And some people are fascinated by how long you've known Angela and how deep your friendship is. And how often, people are asking, how often do you still talk or see Angela?
So, okay, I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, and of course people know that Angela was born in Birmingham. And in the summers, her mother, Mrs. Davis, came to New York because she was getting a master's degree in education at NYU. And she stayed with the family of Lewis and Dorothy Burnham. And Margaret Burnham, who's in the film, who was one of her lawyers, the very young black woman. In the film, she's very young. We're all very young. And especially in the original footage. Oh my goodness. Anyway, the Burnhams, the Apthekers, and the Davises were friends. That's what it was. So the parents were friends. And that's why Angela and I met when we were so young. And then she went to high school at Elizabeth Irwin High School in New York on a scholarship from the Quakers, from the Friends Service Committee. And she lived in Brooklyn at the home of Reverend Howard Mellish. And we all knew Reverend Mellish, and she lived at that home. And so she and I, and Margaret Burnham and a lot of other people, put together sort of a socialist youth organization that was called Advance. And we were teenagers. We were 14, 15 years old. And it was right at the start of the civil rights movement in the South, with the sit-ins and so forth. So we were in solidarity with that. And so that's when we first connected with each other. Then Angela went to Brandeis for college. I went to UC Berkeley. Then she was in Europe for a while. I was in Berkeley. So I did not do graduate education until later. She did her graduate education earlier. So we were separated for a long, long time then, in that period. And then we came together, as we showed in the film and in our lives, during her case. I had been fairly active, in Berkeley and in the free speech movement and so forth. So I went down to LA when she was first fired and helped with that. And we reunited at that time. And so I'd say now what happens is then for a number of years, we didn't, after the trial was over, we would see each other occasionally. Then we worked together on the committee to the National Committee on Political and Racist Repression, and then I was part of the founding of Critical Resistance, so there were moments when we interacted again. And then she taught here at UC Santa Cruz for I guess it was almost 20 years, in the History of Consciousness program, and was also affiliated with Feminist Studies, which is where I was. So we reconnected again. And now I'd say we just saw each other last October because there was a conference honoring her at Radcliffe, because her papers are now available at the Schlesinger Library. And so I was part of that, and we spent some time together. But I would say we don't, so it's not like we see each other all the time or anything like that, but we correspond via email, or occasions will arise. And this book that I'm working on, she has the the chapter outline and prospectus for it, was I'm hoping we'll have a conversation about that and so on. So that's kind of sometimes it's intense and sometimes it's more every few months or whatever.
That's wonderful. Your friendship is with Dr. Davis is wonderful.
I just want to say, I think we love each other, and we've known each other our whole lives. So we're the same age. So we were in our mid-20s when her trial happened, and now we're both 76. She just turned 77. She turned 77 January 26th. And
That's my birthday.
I won't get there until September.
That's my birthday too. Well, I have learned so much today, and I thank you for your work in the past, your kind of leadership in during these challenging times, and for the advice for the future, both for us as teachers and community members. And I'm going to be looking forward to seeing you at our next event. And we're going to have Professor Halima wrap it up for us. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, Edie.
Dr. Aptheker, thank you so much. I never tire from hearing your stories. You are living history, and your experiences are incredible. We have so much to learn from you. And we will be seeing Dr. Aptheker next week for our panel on the 9th, where she will be in conversation with Drs. Barbara Ransby and Dr. Nefertiti Tadir, in talking about the work of Dr. Davis. And so please register for that. Also, then we have Dr. Davis herself on the 11th for our keynote and launch event. So please register for those. They'll be wonderful events, and we hope you'll join us next week. Register, please. And also, we'd like to recognize our co-sponsors, our generous campus co-sponsors for supporting this year's series: the Mosaic Cultural Center, the Cesar Chavez Community Action Center, the Ethnic Studies Collaborative, the Departments of African American Studies, Sociology, Justice Studies, Political Science, Journalism and Mass Communications, and History, and our community co-sponsors, Silicon Valley Debug. Thanks everyone for the wonderful questions. We hope you have a fantastic night, and we'll see you next week for our second and third events. Have a good night.